Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening. Welcome to today's Security Boulevard webinar. My name is Sharon Florentine. Thank you so much for joining us. Before we get started today, I just have a few housekeeping items I need to go through with you. Just a reminder that today's webinar is being recorded, so if you miss any or all of it, you can go back and watch it again. We'll be sending an email with instructions for how to access the webinar on demand, or you can visit us at securityboulevard.com/webinars and it will be there for you. We are taking questions today from the audience, so submit your questions using the Q&A tab on your console, and we will try and get to them at the end of the presentation. With that, I'm pleased to introduce today Shiri Ivtsan, who is the Director of Product at WhiteSource, and Lena, Kleyner, who's a Product Manager at WhiteSource. And they're going to be speaking to you today about the State of Open Source Security Vulnerabilities, WhiteSource's annual report for 2021. Thank you so much for joining us today. I'm going to turn my camera off, put myself on mute, and let you get right to it.
Thank you, Sharon. Thanks for the intro. And thanks everyone for joining this webinar. So today we have a very exciting session. We are going to discuss our annual report. So hi, Lena.
Hi.
It's great to have you with us today. And again, so today we're going to discuss the latest report by WhiteSource for open source vulnerabilities. In this report, we tried to analyze and put together all the statistics and trends from WhiteSource vulnerability database and try to gain some insights on the state of open source security vulnerabilities, try to learn some best practices on how to address these trends that we see, and sort of try to not really predict, but analyze the trends that we see and see how they actually affect the way that we will treat security vulnerabilities and specifically open source security vulnerabilities during 2021. So we will discuss all of these and probably some more items during the webinar. So the first thing and the first insight that we see, this is no surprise for any of us probably, open source vulnerabilities are on the rise. And we see this trend going for like 8 or 10 years now. Open source vulnerabilities keep on rising. So we can see that in 2020, last year, it rose by over 50%. And the actual number of open source vulnerabilities was way over 9,000 vulnerabilities. And we see that this trend is actually going with us more or less from 2009. And the main question is, okay, we understand that open source vulnerabilities keep rising and we have more and more of them because there is more code that is being written. And it's just natural that if there is more code, there are more vulnerabilities. But it's not the only thing. We can see that it rose significantly, like by more than 50%. So this is interesting. And one of the questions that I try to ask is, what are the reasons for this sharp increase? Is there anything in particular that we can see during 2020 that caused such a big increase in the number? And there are 3 main things that I saw. There may be more, but these are the main trends that we see. Both from the database, but also from our customers and the market. So first of all, we can see an increased activity in open source community. More code is being written, more projects are being created. And 2020 has been an interesting year, right? It's been the year of COVID. Sort of in the beginning of 2020, like March and April, we all moved to working remotely. We saw companies sort of shifting the budget. So the budget that was initially planned to be for application security was shifted to, moving all the employees to work remotely. Some of them may have laptops, some of them don't. Some of them don't even have internet or high-speed internet in their homes. So sort of we saw that budget for application security freezing, and budget is shifting. But another thing that we saw is that there was increased activity in open source community. So if we look at GitHub, for example, they reported a sharp increase in open source project creation during March and April of 2020. So we all moved to working from home, but open source developers actually worked a lot harder. So this is the first trend that we see. And it makes sense that if we have more code written, we have more vulnerability. The second is the addition of CVE numbering authorities, or CNAs. CNAs are the security organizations that are actually able to register or publish or disclose vulnerabilities to the NVD. So we saw more and more of these over the year. And we saw also that GitHub Security Labs launched over a year ago now, and they invested a lot of effort in detecting and fixing and publishing new vulnerabilities in open source components. So we see more and more organizations joining as CNAs. And to better understand this item, I think we need to understand something about the disclosure policy in the open source. And there are some good news here, actually. So when WhiteSource, for example, as a CNA, detects a suspected vulnerability or a vulnerability in, let's say, a GitHub repository, it cannot just go and report about it to the NVD. We actually work together with the maintainer of that open source repository to make sure that there is a new version with a fix. Only once there's a version with the fix of that vulnerability, we actually go together with the maintainer and we update the NVD. So these are good news because it means that more than 85% of the vulnerabilities that are being published in the NVD already have a new version with a fix. So if we keep our version up to date, we are a lot more secure. So we will touch more on that and how to automate the remediation later. In addition to that, we saw extensive use of automated scanning and detection tools to find vulnerabilities in open source. So tools like WhiteSource, for example, use all kinds of patterns, regex, and even machine learning algorithms to detect suspected vulnerabilities in the open source. So not all of them, of course, are zero-day vulnerabilities, but some are. So using these automations, we're actually able to find and fix security vulnerabilities quickly, but also at a greater volume. So we think that this may be one of the reasons for the sharp increase in the number of open source vulnerabilities. Next, we are going to discuss a little bit about which programming languages are most secure.
So we also looked at some of the top programming languages. We basically wanted to see how many open source security vulnerabilities were disclosed in each of them in 2020. And we see that the biggest shift this year in the number of reported vulnerabilities comparing to the previous year happened in C, in PHP, and in Go. In C, there was an increase in the number of vulnerabilities comparing to the previous year. We see a higher number of issues related to buffer overflow weakness type, which is why there were so many new vulnerabilities in C in 2020. And we'll touch a bit on that later on. In PHP, however, we see an opposite trend. We see a decrease in the number of vulnerabilities reported in comparing to 2019. This might be explained by the decreased popularity of PHP as reported by GitHub. On the other side, we can see a big increase in Go. Go is a relatively young language, which is gaining more and more popularity. And the rising number of vulnerabilities might be a result of the many new projects that are being written from scratch in Go. So comparing to other open source libraries that have been under the security Microsoft for years, new projects will result in new issues being found. So these trends are really interesting they might suggest a correlation to this popularity of these programming languages in the open source community, but also beyond it. Because as the popular open source libraries have many eyes watching the code and raising issues. So as Shiri mentioned, we saw a big rise in the number of open source security vulnerabilities published this year. And addressing this big rise is quite a challenge to software companies. In most cases, it's really impossible to fix all vulnerabilities without slowing down the pace of development. So how can it be solved? The solution has to be prioritization. Once vulnerabilities are detected, team needs to find ways to prioritize them. One parameter that many organizations look to when attempting to decide what to remediate first is the severity score of the vulnerabilities. So that is why we wanted to check the breakdown of the severity score of the newly reported vulnerabilities in 2020 to see if this is indeed might be an effective technique. So if we look at the pie chart, we can see that over 50% of the new open source vulnerabilities found this year were rated high or critical. And this fact actually doesn't help security and develop teams relying on the severity score to decide what issues to address first. So organization needs to leverage prioritization and remediation tools that target the vulnerabilities with the highest impact to manage their security depth wisely. So we need to find ways to prioritize. And so let's talk about that. How can we prioritize? One important strategy is focusing on the reachable vulnerabilities by performing an effective usage analysis. Basically, this means checking which of the vulnerabilities are indeed reachable by the proprietary code. This actually is a very effective method because it reduces the number of real vulnerabilities that need to be mitigated in a higher percentage. Around 85% of the vulnerabilities can be filtered out if we're looking at the effectiveness. But even after we're filtering out this major number, we still are faced with the challenge of prioritizing the remaining ones. And how can we do that? By several methods. One of them is, of course, the severity score that we are discussing here, but we can apply more advanced technique by adding more factors to the equation. Some of the factors can be business impact. For example, if let's say we have a security vulnerability that affects an application, it is important to know whether the application is a public-facing application, whether this application holds some sensitive information, whether it's under some regulatory constraints. It will, if so, it will higher the priority of the fix. In addition, we can look at more factors like the availability of a fix, the ease of remediation, and malicious package probability. So open source security tools and processes need to be utilized as early as possible in the development lifecycle in order to address the high number of vulnerabilities. However, we do not expect our developer to be security experts. So we need to provide them with automated tools that will not only detect those vulnerabilities, but also prioritize and remediate them for the developers. We see that the application security continues to shift left into the design and development phases, and the responsibility over security is shared with developers. This means that secure coding practices and tools become an important part of the DevSecOps pipeline.
So one other question or insight that we wanted to show is which CWEs do we need to watch out for in 2020? And we see that the trend is more or less what it has been in the recent years. So we look at cross-site scripting, CWE 79. This one actually continues to dominate in most programming languages that we looked at, especially those that are used for web development. Maybe another reason for the how XSS is popular and the popularity of that specific CWE is because it's actually easier to detect this one using automated tools. And we already discussed before the trend of automating the detection. So this may be one of the parameters as well. The second that we see is CWE 787, which is the out of bounds write. This one is specifically popular in C language and similar. So we think that this may be the reason we saw the high rise in vulnerabilities in C. So these are just some of the parameters that we looked at. Again, what we have in the full report is also a breakdown of the CWEs per language, for example. So we can see that the out of bounds write is specifically relevant in C. However, the XSS is more relevant in web development. So those are kinds of the breakdowns that you can see in the full report. So some takeaways out of the webinar. First of all, open source security just remains a top concern. We can see that open source vulnerabilities are on the rise, but not only that, we can see that they are on the rise in languages that are more and more popular. So we can no longer ignore open source security, and we need to continue and address this during 2021 and the years to come. The second thing is that application security continues to shift left. So we see more and more development teams aware of security. We see teams that are trying to remediate and to detect vulnerabilities as early as they can in the life cycle. And this actually matches with all the things that we saw here, both with the popularity, but also with the different CWEs that we saw. So as application security continues to shift left, we see more organizations adopting the DevSecOps approach. As Lena said before, we don't want the developers to be security experts, but we do want them to have the right tools to handle security and to remediate. We also see that prioritization and remediation strategies are super important because we see that we have more and more vulnerabilities. Most of the vulnerabilities, at least half of them, are high critical. So we understand that not all vulnerabilities will be solved or even addressed. We may not be able to manually prioritize all the vulnerabilities. And we also see that it's not needed. So using tools like reachability or effective usage analysis, understanding which actual method, vulnerable method, is being called by my proprietary code, I'm actually able to filter out many of the vulnerabilities. Then, with the rest, I need to implement strategies of prioritization, scoring, and auto-remediation. And again, automation is the key. So everything that can be automated should be automated. We really want you to be able to focus on what matters to the organization and not on understanding a specific security vulnerability or other, because there are tools for that. We want to make sure that if there is an option to have an automated pull request, it should be handled that way. So these are the main takeaways. I see that we already have some questions from the audience. So Sharon?
Awesome. Yes, so we do have some questions here, and I wanted to remind the audience to keep submitting those questions. If Shiri and Lena don't get to them right now, please rest assured we will be sending them all the questions and they will get back to you afterwards. So with that, let's see, we've got, here's a great one. What is the role of the security person in the DevSecOps world?
So I think this is a really good question. I mean, we keep getting this in from customers, for example, that are learning for the first time about, how developers are important, this security world, and they're sort of getting a little scared. I mean, okay, is there going to be a security team? Is it even needed? in the world of DevSecOps? And our approach and our answer to that is definitely. I mean, the security team has the most important role in implementing DevSecOps approach, or in actually making sure that this is even a discussion within the organization, right? We want to make sure that you as security teams will facilitate this discussion. So, for example, we discussed before on prioritization and remediation. One of the main roles of you as a security person is to make sure that you prioritize correctly and also that you remediate the right things. So you have all these great tools, right, that integrate with the pipeline and integrate with the software lifecycle, but we do want to make sure that the developers, actually fix what's important to the business. They fix what has the highest business impact. And this is on the security teams to facilitate.
Okay. So here's another good one. Are these all the languages where vulnerabilities were found? How about other programming languages such as Rust?
Thanks, Sharon. This is a good question. Our report focused on the top programming languages, but that definitely doesn't mean that there were no security vulnerabilities, new security vulnerabilities found on libraries written on other languages. We wanted to examine the most popular languages and look for interesting trends. That's why we limited the amount of language we looked for. But of course, there were more other vulnerabilities disclosed this year on other languages as well. And Rust is one of them, of course.
Okay. All right. I think we've got time for one more here. As a security person watching this webinar, what would my next step be?
So I think that's a very good question. I think that it may be overwhelming to see all of these statistics and trends, and you're sort of wondering, okay, so what do I do tomorrow morning when I come to the office? And it's a great question. There's definitely a lot to do around application security, but if we look specifically at open source and we see these trends, I would definitely say focus on prioritization. Focus on the fact that you actually handle and remediate the security vulnerabilities that are the most important ones. Because we know that there is a lot of friction between development teams and security teams. So development teams would have, as all of us, limited time to fix vulnerabilities, and we want to make sure that they focus on what's needed. So if I was that security person, I would definitely find my prioritization strategy that fits my organization. Again, not all organizations have the same needs, but I think that this would be the most important thing.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you both so much for that amazing presentation and your time. Just as a reminder to the audience, this has been recorded. So if you missed any or all of it, you can go back and watch it again. We are going to send an email with instructions for how to access it on demand. You can also visit us at securityboulevard.com/webinars. I would like to personally thank Lena and Shiri for their time here today. And thank you so much to the audience for tuning in. We hope to see you again soon. I'm Sharon Florentine, signing off.